Elena had touched hundreds of patients in her life, maybe more, and skin had always been just skin to her, a surface, a system, a symptom, something to understand and manage and leave behind at the end of a shift. But this was different. This was Damien Cross, and her hands didn't know what to do with him. Her fingers hovered at the base of his spine, barely brushing the taut line of muscle above his hip, where the nerves ran hot and the air felt too still, and she could hear her own breath louder than the soft jazz playing overhead, louder even than the wind pressing against the glass walls of the estate. Outside, the rain had started again, quiet and steady, but inside the room the air was too warm and the silence too close. And when she adjusted the angle of her touch, her gloves creaked against the skin of his back, and he spoke, not loudly, just enough to cut through whatever thoughts she'd been clinging to. "You're hesitating again," he said, his voice low and calm and sharp at the edges. She responded without thinking, trained by years of protocol. "It's a sensitive area. I need to avoid pressure on the sciatic nerve." But even she could hear the tension in her tone, the slight tremor under the words, and she knew he heard it too. "That's not why your hands are shaking," he murmured, still face down, still motionless, except for the way his eyes flicked open just enough to find her where she stood, too close to be detached, too still to be unaffected. Elena tried to breathe evenly, tried to remember that this was work, that she was here to help, that the lines were clear and necessary and fixed, but none of those truths mattered when his voice dipped lower and he said, "Say it's nothing. Say this is just part of the job. Say I don't get under your skin." And she did, or tried to, whispering, "It's just work." Because what else was she supposed to say? What other lie would have made more sense? He turned his head slightly, enough that she could see the line of his jaw, the softness in his mouth that didn't match the coldness in his reputation. And then he smiled, not fully, not with amusement, but with something like recognition, as if he'd already heard the words before she said them and had never believed them anyway. "You keep saying that," he replied, "but your body doesn't listen." And before she could speak again, he reached behind him, fingers brushing her wrist, not grabbing, not insisting, just pausing there, waiting. She should have moved, should have stepped back, re-established the boundary with a word or a gesture, or even just a breath, but she didn't, and when his hand guided hers lower, across the dip of his back and the heat of his skin, she didn't resist. The contact wasn't clinical anymore, wasn't professional or required or easily explained, and she felt the moment stretch, elastic and dangerous, filled with a kind of quiet that knew too much. "I didn't ask for anyone," he said after a long silence, voice softer now. "They just sent you." "I know," she said, unsure whether she was apologizing or confessing or neither. "But you stayed." "Yes." He turned fully then, slow and deliberate, and she froze because something in his eyes had shifted, something no longer careful or closed, something raw and searching and deeply, terrifyingly human. "I could fire you," he said, and it wasn't a threat. "You won't." "No," he agreed, reaching for her hand again, his touch deliberate now, real. "I won't." Her breath caught, her body still caught between duty and desire, between ethics and instinct, but his presence didn't feel like danger anymore. It felt like gravity, like something she had been circling for weeks without ever meaning to fall. When his face was inches from hers and her palm still lay flat against the place where his skin met silence, she whispered it again, because it was all she had left, even though they both knew better. "It's just work." But it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. Elena Rivera had never planned on becoming a private nurse. The job had always seemed like a temporary stop, a detour meant to help her catch her breath after everything went wrong, after she walked out of St. Luke's Hospital for the last time with her hands shaking and her pride in pieces. She had once believed she was meant for more, that her years of training and certifications and overnight shifts would eventually lead to something steady, something meaningful, something that made her feel whole again. But the reality of medicine, the brutal speed of loss, and one night with too much blood and not enough help had changed that. She had lost a child that night, not her own, not even someone she had known for more than a few hours. But it didn't matter. The weight of it had stayed, and when the attending physician had told her it wasn't her fault, she had nodded because that was what she was supposed to do. But she had known better. It was always her fault. The monitor had beeped 3 seconds too long before she moved. The dosage had been calculated twice, but not checked 3 times. The crash cart had been a few feet farther than it should have been, and the child had died. That was all there was to it. After that, she left the hospital quietly. No drama, no confrontation. She updated her certifications, took a few counseling sessions because they told her to, then applied for a freelance license and started working with VIP Wellness, an agency that provided private, in-home care for high-profile clients who didn't want their health to become public knowledge. She told herself it was temporary, just until she found her footing again, but 3 years later, she was still taking contracts and still driving out to unfamiliar homes with too much space and not enough warmth. Damien Cross's estate had been just another name on the roster when the agency called. A short-term assignment, post-operative care, no specific complications, the usual vague confidentiality agreement that came with anyone rich enough to demand privacy and powerful enough to enforce it. She hadn't expected anything unusual, hadn't even recognized his name, until she Googled it out of curiosity and found herself staring at headlines about biotech revolutions, mergers worth billions, and a man who never smiled in photographs. When she arrived for the first time, the house manager had given her a quick tour and a warning. Mr. Cross preferred silence. He did not welcome small talk, did not appreciate incompetence, and had declined nearly every nurse assigned to him before her. Elena had nodded, not because she was intimidated, but because she understood the type. Men like that wanted control because they had lost it somewhere else and didn't know how to live without it. The house was enormous, but eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel restful, but defensive. There were no family photos, no scattered signs of life, only clean lines, dark wood, and a view of the ocean that seemed more like a painting than something real. She met him in the therapy room, where he lay shirtless on a padded table, already in position, already silent. He didn't look up when she introduced herself, didn't offer his hand, just said one word begin and closed his eyes. At first, it had been easy to treat him like every other patient. Professional distance was her armor, and Damien gave her every reason to keep it in place. He was cold, clipped, efficient, but not unkind. He followed instructions, tolerated her adjustments, and said, "Thank you," exactly once every session. She worked in silence, took her notes, administered the therapy, and left. But something shifted around the 3rd week. She wasn't sure what did it. Maybe it was the way he looked at her when she corrected his posture, not impatient but curious, like he was trying to understand what it cost her to care. Or maybe it was the night he asked her how long she had been a nurse, and then actually listened to her answer. Maybe it was the time he watched her put away her equipment and said quietly, "You're too good at this to be working for people like me." He hadn't meant it cruelly, and she hadn't taken it that way, but it had stuck with her. She started noticing things about him she hadn't before. The faint lines around his mouth that didn't come from age, but from trying not to say something. The way his fingers twitched slightly when he was in pain but never made a sound. The fact that he never checked his phone during a session, as if he had nowhere better to be. She began to realize that silence wasn't just a preference for him, it was armor too. There was a photo in the hallway outside his office, just one. It showed a woman with light in her eyes and a smile so wide it didn't seem like it belonged in this house. Elena had only glanced at it once, but Damien had caught her. His voice, when he spoke, was different than usual. "That was my wife, was. She didn't ask what had happened. He didn't offer, but something settled between them that day, something heavy and unspoken. From that moment on, the sessions changed. He looked at her more, said her name occasionally, asked small questions that didn't matter, and then waited for answers like they did. And she responded. Because despite everything she'd built around herself, despite the walls and the gloves and the contract, she wanted to. She didn't know what it was about him that made her lower her guard. Maybe it was the grief in his eyes, or the way he never touched her, unless absolutely necessary, or the fact that when he did, it felt like he didn't trust himself either. Whatever it was, it grew, quietly, relentlessly, until one day her hand had lingered too long on his back, and he had noticed. And neither of them had been able to pretend after that. By the end of the 4th week, Elena had memorized the way the light changed in each room of the estate. She had learned which windows stayed cold, no matter how high the sun rose, which hallway creaked no matter how quiet her steps, and which chair Damien preferred when his back began to ache. She had never intended to memorize anything beyond what was necessary for his care. And yet, she knew the rhythm of his breath when he fell asleep in the chair during longer sessions. She knew how he blinked once, never twice, when she applied pressure too low. She even knew that on evenings when he wore dark gray instead of black, it meant he had spoken to his board and left the meeting dissatisfied. These were things no chart would note, no nurse was expected to see. But she saw them anyway. In the beginning, the sessions were standard, structured around healing and rehabilitation. Elena performed her tasks with quiet efficiency. She focused on posture, tension, inflammation, hydration, and every other measurable sign of recovery. Damien responded with silence, occasional nods, and clinical detachment. He asked no questions. He gave no personal information. He did not thank her. And still, he watched everything. She could feel his gaze whenever she moved behind him, steady and unreadable, like he was studying her without agenda, just to know what she would do next. It started to shift slowly, not with grand gestures, not with sudden intimacy. It shifted in the stillness, in the way he remained seated 5 minutes longer after she finished a session, in the way he sometimes asked about her schedule, then changed his own to match, in the way he once placed a mug of tea on the table beside her things before she could reach for her own thermos. He had not said it was for her. She had not asked, but it had been steeped exactly the way she liked, and she had known he knew. She told herself to be careful. The agency had a rule: no personal involvement with clients, no blurring of lines, no engagement outside the parameters of the job. She had signed the code of conduct. She had read every line, but lines meant little when every second she spent in the same room with him felt like something unsaid was being written between them, quiet and invisible, but undeniable. One evening, after an unusually long session where his pain had returned more sharply than usual, Elena asked him how he had slept the night before. He hesitated before answering. "Not well," he said, though he offered no explanation. She told him about a breathing technique she used with elderly patients, something to help regulate REM cycles. He looked at her for a moment too long before saying, "You talk like someone who doesn't believe in sleep herself." She hadn't expected the remark. She hadn't expected how accurate it was. That same night, as she gathered her things to leave, he stood behind her in the foyer. His voice was low. "I canceled tomorrow's physical therapist. I prefer the way you adjust my posture." She turned slowly, unsure whether the statement was meant as a compliment or something more. She looked up at him, met his gaze, but he gave her nothing, just the silence that always came before one of them stepped away first. The next day, it rained, not the gentle kind, but the hard, slanting kind that blurred the world outside the windshield and soaked through her coat before she reached the door. The housekeeper let her in without a word. Damien was already in the library, sitting by the fire. He did not ask why she came. He only said, "You are wet. You should change. There are clean clothes in the guest suite." Her instinct was to refuse, to maintain distance, to remind herself and him of the line that still existed. But her clothes were soaked, and the warmth in his voice had caught her off guard. She changed. When she returned, the room was warm. He had lit a second fire in the adjoining parlor. She found him waiting on the therapy table, his shirt already removed, his gaze distant. She worked in silence, hands steady, movements exact. But when she placed her palm along the curve of his lower back and pressed lightly, he flinched, not from pain, from something else. She drew back, but he did not speak. She apologized softly. "Do not apologize for touching me," he said, not looking at her. Her chest tightened. She did not reply. They continued in silence. After the session, she lingered. Not long, just long enough that the moment expanded without explanation. Damien looked up. "Would you stay, just for a moment?" She hesitated, then sat in the armchair across from him. He poured a drink, one for himself, none for her, though she noticed him glance toward the second glass and think twice. He placed it aside. She asked nothing. He offered nothing, until he spoke. "I built this house because I thought silence was peace, but I think I just wanted to be left alone by people who reminded me I had something to lose." She said nothing at first, unsure if he meant her to hear it. Then finally she replied, "I understand that, more than I want to." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You do, don't you?" She nodded. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to show that she too carried loss like a shadow. Enough to explain the tiredness in her smile, the way she never looked too far ahead. After that night, everything between them felt heavier. Every word, every glance, every silence, and still, neither of them moved closer. Not quite, until the day he touched her hand. They were walking through the hallway, and she had paused near the photo of the woman with the bright smile. She had never asked, never commented, but she always looked. This time, he looked too. "She was good at making people believe they were the center of her world," he said. "She never let me forget she saw me even when I didn't want to be seen." Elena said, "Maybe that is what made her unforgettable." Damien looked down, not at the photo, but at Elena's hand where it rested against the frame. Then he placed his own lightly over hers. Neither of them moved. The moment passed, but the touch stayed. From that day on, nothing between them was quite the same. It was never supposed to go beyond care. The boundaries had been clear from the start, written in policy, signed in ink, reinforced by the cold professionalism that framed every part of her job. Elena had practiced detachment for years. It had become second nature. She could enter a room, administer treatment, chart data, and leave without carrying anything with her. But with Damien, nothing stayed in the lines she drew. Not her thoughts, not her breath, not her quiet recognition of how loneliness seemed to settle deeper in him with every day that passed. She tried to ignore it. She reminded herself that some wounds were not hers to heal, and yet, the more time she spent in that house, the more she stopped feeling like a nurse and more like something undefined, something tethered to him in ways she could not explain. Damien rarely spoke of himself. His answers were short, precise, and only relevant to whatever medical question she asked. He did not fill silence. He let it stretch, and in that space Elena began to understand just how much he had learned to live with absence. But one night, as she was packing up her equipment, he asked her what it felt like to lose someone without warning. The question was quiet, almost casual, like it could be mistaken for small talk. She did not answer immediately. She set down the blood pressure cuff, sat in the chair beside him, and said it felt like breathing in a room that had no air. He nodded, said nothing more, and stared at the fire until it burned low. She should have left then, but she didn't. She sat beside him until the flames were only embers. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The weight of their silences had started to match. The next evening, it was Damien who lingered. He waited by the door as she packed her bag. He looked at her like he was about to speak, but stopped. She waited. He tried again, more slowly this time. When I was 25, I met someone who taught me what it meant to be seen. His voice was steady, but Elena could hear something under it, something tight. We were married by 27. She was sick by 30, dead by 31. I was not prepared. He paused, not for her laughter, not for her pain, not for the way it felt to walk into a room and forget there was no reason to smile anymore. Elena remained still. She didn't reach for him. She didn't speak. She just listened, and in that listening, he seemed to find the strength to continue. They told me it was a rare complication, that it could have happened to anyone, that no one was at fault. He looked away then, eyes fixed on a point just past the edge of her shoulder. I believed them until I saw the report, until I saw the drug label, until I realized that her name had been written on the wrong line of the chart, that she had received the wrong dose, that her death had a barcode. Elena felt the words like static, buzzing against her skin. She had known this pain. Not the same details, not the same story, but the same ache. The knowledge that one decision, one misstep, could collapse a life. She reached forward then, not to console him, not to fix anything, but because something inside her recognized the shape of what he carried. My mistake was smaller, she said, but I still see his face when I sleep. He was 6, no parents at his bedside, just me and the monitor and a failing heart. I did everything right, but not fast enough. Damien looked at her then, and in that shared glance, something opened between them, something quiet and dangerous, something that whispered they were no longer strangers to each other's grief. After that night, they moved differently, not closer, not quite, but more aware. She noticed how he watched her more carefully, how he began asking about her opinions instead of just her instructions. He noticed how she stayed 5 minutes longer, how her hands rested a second more when she adjusted his posture. They spoke in softer tones. They filled space with presence instead of distance. She brought tea on a morning when his pain was worse. He asked her how her mother was doing without prompting. These things, small as they were, started to build something fragile and real. One afternoon, he invited her to walk the grounds with him. His back was healing well enough to manage a short distance. She agreed. The air was sharp with early winter, and the wind carried salt from the sea. They walked slowly, side by side, without purpose or direction. He spoke of the trees, the renovation plans, the fact that the greenhouse had not been used in years. She asked why he kept the property so isolated. He said privacy had become his only form of safety. They reached the far side of the garden, where a narrow path wound around a stone wall. He stopped and looked at her, really looked, as if deciding whether or not to speak what weighed on him. "I hate hospitals," he said, not because of what happened, but because of how familiar it felt to be invisible. Elena understood. She nodded. He continued. "When I see you, I don't feel like a patient. I don't feel like someone who needs fixing. I just feel—" She wanted to respond, to say something honest and unguarded, but the words caught in her throat. That evening, after the session ended, he stood near the door again. She'd expected him to say good night. Instead, he asked if she would stay for dinner. It was the first time he had ever asked. She hesitated, then nodded. The meal was quiet, not awkward, just careful. They talked about books, about how she read medical journals before bed out of habit. He said he hadn't read anything for pleasure in years. She told him he should start again. He asked what book she would recommend. She said something about grief. He laughed, dry and short, and said he was tired of grief. "So am I," she replied. They moved to the sitting room after. She settled on the edge of the couch. He sat beside her, not close, not distant. They said nothing for a long time. The fire cracked softly. Outside, wind touched the windows like fingertips. She shifted slightly, and he mirrored the motion. Her hand brushed against his. She did not move it. Neither did he. Eventually, she stood. He did too. Their eyes met. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he replied. She turned, walked to the door, but something made her stop. She looked back. His eyes were still on her, not asking, not begging, just waiting. She stepped toward him again, not fast, not hesitant, just certain. When she reached him, she lifted her hand, placed it lightly over his heart. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, he did not flinch. The storm rolled in late. It came without warning, sweeping across the coastline in heavy sheets of rain and low rumbles of thunder that echoed against the wide glass panels of the estate. Elena arrived soaked to the bone despite the forecast, despite the layers she had wrapped around herself that morning, despite her intention to remain unshaken by anything outside or inside that house. But nothing had gone according to plan for weeks now, and that night would be no exception. Damien was already waiting in the therapy room when she entered, his shirt off, a folded towel draped over his lap, his posture rigid in the half-lit room. He looked up when she came in, his eyes scanning her quickly, not with impatience, but with something closer to concern. "You are late," he said. "There is a tree down on the main road," she replied, closing the door behind her, her clothes clinging to her frame with every step. "I had to take a different route." "You should have called." "I was already halfway here," she said, setting her bag down and pulling out her supplies with practiced hands. "I did not want to cancel." She didn't say the rest of it out loud, the part about how she could not have stayed away even if she had tried. He said nothing more, just watched her move. She changed into the spare set of scrubs she kept in the cabinet down the hall, towel-dried her hair as best she could, and returned to find the fire lit, casting long shadows against the wood-paneled walls. "Let us begin," she said, her voice steadier than her pulse. He shifted to lie down, turning his head toward the window where the rain now danced in erratic rhythm. She applied oil to her palms, warm from the small heater she'd started keeping in the corner. Her hands met his back, and everything else faded. At first, it was all routine. She worked down his spine, pressing firmly where the tension gathered, pausing to adjust her angle, shifting as he responded. But then her fingers moved lower, to the base of his back, just along the edge of the towel, and his body tensed beneath her touch, not in pain, but in stillness. She hesitated. His voice, when it came, was rougher than usual. "Do not stop." Her hands moved again, slower now, more deliberate. He exhaled. The air between them grew thicker. The next moment came too fast and too slow. He turned slightly, reached back, and took her wrist in his hand. The gesture was not forceful. It was quiet, precise, like everything he did. He held her there, letting her feel the heat of his skin, the way his breath had changed. "Elena," he said. She did not answer. "Say it," he whispered. "Say what? That this is not just work anymore." Her heart pounded in her chest, loud enough that she was sure he could hear it. Her fingers curled slightly against his skin. She closed her eyes for a second too long. When she opened them again, he was looking up at her, and everything that had been simmering beneath weeks of silence, of glances, of unfinished words, came to a boil. She leaned in, slowly, carefully, testing the space between what she wanted and what she feared. He met her halfway. The kiss was not soft, it was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that carried months of restraint and denial and grief, the kind that demanded something they had both been afraid to claim. His hands found her waist, drew her closer. She let him, let herself. her body folded into his without hesitation. They did not speak, not when he guided her down onto the mat beside him, not when her fingers pulled at the edge of the towel, not when his mouth found her neck, her shoulder, her collarbone. There were no explanations, no apologies, just heat and breath and skin, just the sound of rain against the windows and the fire crackling behind them, and the quiet way her name left his lips when he thought she could not hear it. He undressed her slowly, with care but not caution. She did the same. When they finally touched without barriers, it was not frantic. It was not perfect, but it was real. Every motion carried intent. Every glance held something fragile and powerful. Their bodies fit like they had not been meant to belong anywhere else. When it was over, they lay side by side, the fire now low and glowing, the storm still pounding outside, as if it had not noticed what had changed in the room. Elena stared at the ceiling, trying to name the feeling in her chest, something sharp and soft all at once. Damien turned to her, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I do not know what this means," he said. "Neither do I," she replied. "But it was not nothing," he said. "No," she whispered. "It was not." She dressed in silence. He watched her, but said nothing. When she reached the door, she paused, looked back. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked. "You always do," she replied, and then she left. The next morning, the air inside the estate felt different, not heavy, not silent, but still, like something sacred had happened, and neither of them quite knew what to do with it. Elena arrived at her usual time, earlier than she should have, earlier than her body had wanted, but routine had always been her compass when emotion threatened to take the wheel. She wore the same expression she always did, calm, focused, unreadable, but inside, her nerves hummed. Damien was already in the library when she walked in, dressed, composed, not on the therapy table but standing near the window, coffee in one hand, posture perfectly straight. He turned when he heard her footsteps and their eyes met. There was no smile, no tension, no sign of what had passed between them the night before, and that silence hurt more than it should have. "Good morning," she said. He nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and said nothing. She hesitated. "Do you still want to proceed with your session?" "Not today," he replied. A pause. "Everything all right, just tired." She nodded once, held his gaze for another second, then turned and left the room. No fight, no demand, no explanation. But something in her chest folded in on itself as she walked back down the hall, the sound of his silence echoing louder than any words he might have said. That night, she waited for a message. None came. The next day, she returned to find his assistant waiting at the door instead of Damien. The man handed her an envelope, thanked her for her services, and said the client would not be needing further care. There was no letter, no signature, just the finality of dismissal. Elena walked back to her car, sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, and let the cold air settle around her. She did not cry. She did not scream. But she felt the tremor deep in her spine, the quiet unraveling of something she had not meant to build, and the ache of being left without a single word of acknowledgement. For days, she went through the motions. She told the agency she was available for new assignments. She visited her mother. She cleaned her apartment twice over. She kept her hands busy and her thoughts occupied. But the quiet returned each night. And in that quiet, she saw him. She remembered how he had said her name, how his voice had lowered when they spoke in the garden, how he had touched her not like she was a body, but a presence he had not expected to miss. And she hated how little it took for that memory to undo her resolve. Meanwhile, Damien sat in the same house with the same windows and the same fire, but nothing inside him felt still. His sleep was shorter. his mind sharper but more easily agitated. The reports on his desk remained untouched. His meetings grew clipped. His staff kept their distance. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had drawn the line before things became irreparably complicated, that he had protected her from what he could not offer, but none of that explained the way her absence turned every room into a question. It did not stop him from walking past the therapy room and pausing at the door, knowing she would not be inside. It did not stop him from reaching for his phone in the middle of the night, only to lock it again before he could type her name. One evening, he returned from the city early and went to his office. The door to the side cabinet had not been opened in weeks. Inside it, among stacks of documents and unopened mail, he found the small towel she had used on the day of the storm, folded neatly, still holding the faintest scent of her hands. He stared at it for a long time, then sat down and finally let himself feel everything he had tried so hard to contain. Elena did not expect to hear from him. When her phone buzzed and his name appeared on the screen, she stared at it in disbelief. The message was short. "I was wrong. Please let me see you." She deleted the draft of her reply twice before sending 3 words. Where and when. They met in the city, at the campus clinic where she had recently started volunteering. He arrived wearing the same black coat she remembered, but he looked older than he had just a week ago. She met him outside after her shift, still in scrubs, hair pulled back, heart unsteady. "You came." She said, "I needed to," he replied. They walked without speaking, through the side streets of the university, past old buildings and late-night cafes. When they stopped, it was not because they had reached a destination, but because they could not pretend they were strangers anymore. "I was afraid," he said. "So was I. I told myself that letting you go would be mercy," he continued, "that keeping you near would only hurt you." "And did it?" she asked. "Hurt me?" "Yes," he said. "But leaving you," he paused, "that hurt more." She looked at him, really looked, saw the lines beneath his eyes, the hesitation in his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight, like he still was not sure he deserved to stand still in front of her. "You do not get to decide for me," she said. "I know you do not get to love me in silence and let me leave because it is easier." "I know, so why now?" "Because I finally realize that nothing I build, no success I achieve, no quiet I chase will ever mean anything if you are not standing next to me when I find it." Her breath caught, not from shock, but from recognition. She had waited for those words, not because she needed an apology, but because she needed to believe that what they had meant enough to fight for. "So what now?" she asked. "Now I ask you," he said, "to come back, not to the house, not to the sessions, but to me." She hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because she had finally rebuilt the parts of herself that had been too quick to give, and he saw that. He stepped closer, not to press, not to push, but to offer. "I will not ask you to give up anything. I only want to give you the one thing I never knew how to offer before. Choice." And for the first time since that night, she smiled. A real one. Not because the pain was gone, but because it was finally shared. They did not return to the estate. Damien sold it a month later without making a single public comment, without so much as a photograph taken from inside its tall glass windows. And Elena never asked where the proceeds went, though she suspected most of it was redirected to the foundation he quietly established in his late wife's name, a place meant to fund medical safety training and emergency care programs for underserved clinics across the state. He did not talk about it, but she saw it in the way his expression changed when he read the reports, how his shoulders eased just slightly when a new wing was opened in a rural town he had never visited. They moved into a modest brownstone near the hospital where she had started full-time work again, not in the ICU this time, but in a post-trauma support clinic where she met patients not as conditions or charts or liability risks, but as people who had already survived the worst day of their lives and did not need someone to fix them, just someone to stand beside them while they figured out how to live again. She liked the quiet there, the way stories unfolded slowly, without alarms or sirens, the way healing had become more about presence than intervention, and Damien, for all his guarded instincts and hardwired logic, understood that better than she had expected. He came to the clinic sometimes, never unannounced but always discreet, sometimes with files in hand, other times just to walk her home. He learned the names of her colleagues, remembered the patients who had made her cry behind a closed door, and one evening she found him waiting outside with 2 paper cups of the tea he had memorized from her cabinet, not because he wanted to impress her, but because he had noticed she had forgotten to eat that morning. They rarely talked about the night when everything changed, not because it did not matter, but because the truth of it no longer needed to be explained. It had been real. It had been sudden. It had been necessary. But what came after it mattered more. The quiet mornings when she stepped out of the shower and found a clean towel already waiting. The late evenings when he let her read medical journals out loud just to hear her voice filling the space between them. The Saturdays when they argued over furniture and plants, and which shade of paint felt more like a room that could hold both of them without tipping too far in either direction. They did not move quickly. They did not use words like forever or destiny or fate, but they began to use we without thinking and yours without resistance, and little by little, the walls they had once used to protect themselves became the frame of something neither of them had expected to find again. One evening, as the light faded over the quiet city skyline, they sat on the back steps of the brownstone, sharing a blanket and a cup of something warm, the kind of stillness between them that no longer needed to be filled. Damien reached over and took her hand, not as a gesture, not as a promise, just as something natural. She looked at him and asked, "When did it stop feeling like recovery and start feeling like life?" He smiled, leaned in, and said, "When you stopped treating me like a man who needed to be healed and started treating me like someone worth keeping." She squeezed his hand, leaned her head on his shoulder, and said, "You never needed healing. You just needed a place to rest." They did not need to name what they had. It lived in the way he reached for her at night without waking, in the way she left space in her drawer for his keys and notes and receipts, in the way their days moved like they had always been meant to share them. They still fought sometimes. She was stubborn. He was quiet to the point of infuriating. She cried over patience. He shut down when something went wrong. But they returned to each other every time, not with apologies but with presence, with dinner left out on the counter, with hands brushing in the hallway, with the kind of silence that no longer felt like avoidance but comfort. Months passed, seasons changed, and the world did what it always does. It kept moving, but they had stopped running. One night, long after midnight, Elena woke to find Damien sitting at the foot of the bed, her name in his voice like a thought he could not shake. She reached for him and asked, "What is it?" He looked at her and said, "Sometimes I think about how close I came to walking away from this, from you, and how lucky I was that you stayed long enough for me to realize what I had." She smiled sleepily and replied, "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is stay just long enough for them to find their way back to you." He lay down beside her, wrapped his arm around her waist, and whispered something so quiet it barely registered, but she felt it anyway, not in her ears but in her spine, in her chest, in her breath. It was not a confession or a vow. It was a truth, and it was enough. In the end, they were not a miracle. They were not perfect. They were 2 people who had been broken in different ways, who had not been looking for love or rescue or redemption, but who had found something gentler than all of that, a reason to stay, a reason to begin again, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst thing that had ever happened to them was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a better one. Sometimes love is not the cure. Sometimes it is just the hand you hold while you figure out how to keep going.